Hi everybody. So I'm just going to do another little session. Sorry, that's my husband coughing in the background. It's about mood, mother and infant, oxytocin, lactation and postpartum depression. So I thought that was incredibly important for us to watch. So I'm just going to share the screen. And so yeah. Okay, this is going to be a good one. Okay. I'll make it nice and big.
Don't forget to check in with us on social media and let us and others know what you're enjoying about the conference. Find us on Facebook and join our discussions. We love sharing lactation news and articles, so stay up to date by liking our page. We're also on Twitter with the handle ILactation, where we'll keep you up to date about our current and upcoming conferences and share news about our speakers. And do have a look at our new Instagram account and be part of our growing community on there too. Please welcome back Dr. Alison Stubbe, who is now presenting her second talk for us, this time called Mood, Mother and Infant, Oxytocin, Lactation and Postpartum Depression. Thank you, Dr. Stubbe.
Hello. I'm very pleased to talk with you today about mood, mother, and infant, oxytocin, lactation, and postpartum depression. During today's talk, we'll discuss the relationship between breastfeeding and depression, explore some of the underlying biology and physiology, and most importantly, talk about strategies that you may be able to use to help your patients to achieve their infant feeding goals. These are my disclosures. At the bottom, you'll note that I have 3 children and I have breastfed for a total of 10.5 years. I share that in part because it's a bit of an accomplishment and something that many of you have probably achieved as well, but also because I think it's important to recognize that our biases are not only a function of our financial relationships or our research funding, but also our own personal experience. And most folks who are interested in lactation and support breastfeeding moms and babies have had long and very positive experiences of breastfeeding. And some mothers don't have that experience, and it's important that we keep in mind that what we've experienced as mothers may influence our counseling, and we need to stop for a moment and listen to the woman in front of us. So I want to start with a case. This is a patient who came to see me at my breastfeeding medicine clinic. She's a 37-year-old G2 P1011 at 17 days postpartum who came to see me for sore nipples. She'd had an uncomplicated vaginal birth, followed by several days of cluster feeding with considerable nipple trauma. A tongue and lip tie had been cut on day 5. Due to concerns about weight gain, the family was counseled to wake the infant to feed every 3 hours. Mastitis was diagnosed on day 12. When she was seen for the mastitis evaluation, she hadn't slept for more than 45 minutes in a row since the baby's birth. The father traveled out of town frequently due to work, and the couple had hired a night doula to help with feedings. The patients who come to our breastfeeding medicine clinic fill out an intake questionnaire, and next to a question about the baby's latch, the mother had written, "He gets what he needs at my expense." This is one of the reasons I wanted to mention my own 10.5 years of breastfeeding. I don't think I ever thought of my children as getting what they needed at my expense, but this statement really reflected the distress that this woman was experiencing. The mom said that she was dumbfounded to learn that she had to feed her baby every 3 hours, and this is what she said to me. "I can't see the light at the end of the tunnel. Sometimes I feel like I can't breathe. All I do is feed my baby, and then people tell me to go take a nap while they hold him or go for walks with him. I feel torn between being a happy, good formula feeding mother and being a feeding trough for my baby while I have a nervous breakdown." It's a pretty powerful and pretty negative description of this woman's experience of motherhood. She completed an Edinburgh postnatal depression screen, and we'll talk more about that scale later, and her score was a 19. Now, the worst you can get is a 30, and anything over 12 is quite concerning for depression. So this mother was really, really struggling with breastfeeding. So during today's talk, we're going to begin by reviewing what's known about the relationship between breastfeeding and postpartum depression. Then we'll get into some science. I like to say this is the geek out portion of the presentation, where we'll explore some of the mechanisms linking depression with breastfeeding difficulties. And then my hope is that you'll be able to devise strategies for treating depression and supporting ongoing breastfeeding. So for those who are not so into science, I hope you'll stick with me because at the end it does get really practical, but we will get a little esoteric for part of the talk. So first, I think it's very important that we all understand the relationship between breastfeeding and postpartum depression. The conventional wisdom is that breastfeeding prevents postpartum depression. This is a flyer from the Joint Commission, which accredits hospitals in the United States, and in their Speak Up campaign for what you need to know about breastfeeding, they state, the many health benefits of breastfeeding include less risk of postpartum depression for you. And it's actually quite commonly argued that breastfeeding promotes bonding and keeps moms from becoming depressed. And those statements are based on the observation that if you find a group of mothers who have 3-month-old babies and are successfully exclusively breastfeeding, that group of mothers is less likely to be experiencing depression than a group of women who aren't able to exclusively breastfeed and are supplementing or formula feeding at 3 months. But it's not entirely clear that the breastfeeding is preventing the depression. In fact, it might be that a mother's underlying anxiety is preventing breastfeeding. This was a prospective cohort study that recruited a group of women at birth and followed them through 8 months postpartum. And during that initial postpartum stay in the hospital, mothers filled out a questionnaire measuring their level of anxiety. And so a low anxiety score is a score less than 40, and a high anxiety score here is a score greater than 40. And what this graph shows is the number of months that have elapsed and the proportion of mothers who are still breastfeeding. And what you can see is that the more anxious mothers were less likely to be breastfeeding all the way out to 8 months postpartum than the less anxious mothers. So those of us who work with new mothers wouldn't be surprised to hear that anxious moms have more difficulty sustaining breastfeeding than relaxed mothers. Indeed, many of us have worked with a mother who says, well, I can't tell how much the baby's getting. Are you sure this is okay? Are you sure that he's growing? Are you sure that this is working right? And those anxious mothers may end up resorting to supplementation because they can't trust that their baby's getting enough, or they're not able to be sure. And so these are the mothers here who are less likely to be breastfeeding than the mothers here who are less anxious at delivery. But it's important because if you look at 4 months, look, breastfeeding protects you from anxiety because the moms who are breastfeeding are less anxious. But in this case, the anxiety came before the early breastfeeding cessation, not the other way around. I'd like to use this analogy of the finish line for the New York Marathon. So here we see runners who are crossing the finish line, and they're pretty fast. It's 3:44, under 4-hour marathon time. And here we see people sitting in the stands who are cheering. And I would argue that these people who are crossing the finish line in 3:44 are more athletic and in better shape than these people sitting at the finish line. They're not in better shape because they just ran a marathon. They just ran a marathon because they are in better shape. And similarly, I'd like to propose that mothers who are able to successfully breastfeed, despite the many barriers that women face to this practice around the world, may be in better shape emotionally and mentally, have more support, and thus be less depressed than women who aren't able to meet that goal. We looked at this issue in a U.S. population to try to measure the prevalence of lactastrophe. This is a word I made up that I'm very proud of, which is early undesired weaning due to lactation problems. And we used data from the Infant Feeding Practices Survey, which was a study conducted from 2004 to 2006 in the United States. Women were asked during pregnancy, how long do you intend to breastfeed? Then they were surveyed monthly to ask whether they were still breastfeeding, and if they stopped, why they stopped. And what we found was that 1 out of 8 women stopped earlier than they desired, said they wished they breastfed longer, and said that the reason they stopped was a function of pain, low milk supply, or latch problems, at least 2 out of 3. 1 out of 8 in the general population, and 1 out of 5 in women who had depression symptoms. Showing those numbers in a numerical fashion, what we saw here was that about 12% of women experienced disrupted lactation, but among those with a normal score on the Edinburgh Depression Scale, only about 11% experienced disrupted lactation, compared to 19% of those who had depression symptoms. We also found that overweight and obesity were associated with an increased risk of women stopping breastfeeding earlier than they desired. This is work out of the UK, where Amy Brown looked at the relationship between stopping breastfeeding and depression symptoms. So the orange here is depression symptoms, and the blue here is duration of breastfeeding. And what she found is the reason you stopped breastfeeding influenced whether or not you experienced depression. Women who stopped breastfeeding because of lack of support had higher depression scores and earlier weaning. Women who stopped breastfeeding because of pressure from others had higher depression scores but breastfed a little bit longer, so they tried to keep it going. Women who stopped breastfeeding because it was inconvenient had lower depression scores than women who stopped for other reasons. So the reason a woman stops breastfeeding may influence whether or not she feels depressed. And then here, those women who stopped breastfeeding because of pain or difficulty had the highest depression scores. So it isn't a simple relationship where breastfeeding keeps depression from happening, but rather the reason a woman stops breastfeeding or continues breastfeeding may influence her mood. And that becomes very, very important when we counsel patients, because the last thing we want to do is say to a mother who really doesn't want to breastfeed, well, if you just keep breastfeeding, your depression will go away, without understanding her particular context. So this is just highlighting the fact that pain and difficulty were most strongly associated with both high depression and shorter duration. So lastly, I want to just highlight the fact that this relationship between short breastfeeding duration and postpartum depression may also have to do with a woman's social circumstances. There's a growing awareness that social determinants of health, where we live, whether we have access to food, clean water, paid leave, all impact health outcomes. And so when we think about structural inequalities, lack of living wage, housing insecurity, disenfranchisement, and discrimination, those problems can affect whether a woman is able to initiate and sustain breastfeeding, whether she has the support that she needs, and they can also affect her mood. So it may be that in some cases this relationship we see between breastfeeding problems or early weaning and depression is not about the breastfeeding, but rather about the life circumstances of the individual woman. And the solution to that is to fix the life circumstances, which will both enable women to breastfeed longer and improve their mood and overall well-being. So what I hope I've impressed upon you is that there is this overlap between perinatal mood disorders, depression and anxiety, and difficulties with breastfeeding. And back in 2012, my colleagues Karen Gruen, Samantha Meltzer-Brody, and I published a paper that explored some of the underlying neuroendocrine mechanisms. So I'm going to talk about some of those in the next few minutes. If you really want to geek out, this paper is available free through PubMed Central, so you can search it and get the full text. I also wanted to lift up this recent systematic review that was published in 2015. The authors went through a broad literature on breastfeeding and depression, and what they concluded was that this review supports the need to identify and help women with depression symptoms during pregnancy or facing problems with breastfeeding at early postpartum in order to enhance breastfeeding and promote postpartum psychological adjustment. So it's both and. If we take good care of mothers, if we support them, if we address their emotional needs and help them to breastfeed their babies, everybody is going to be better off. And simply working harder to breastfeed without addressing those other issues may not necessarily make things better for anyone. So that's the epidemiology. And now we're going to get into the mechanisms linking these two disorders. And this is where I hope you'll be patient because it gets a little geeky, but it's also really fascinating. And I think the fundamental piece to understand here is that breastfeeding is a two-person organ system. Other than reproduction, there's no other feature of physiology that really requires two individuals for it to work. But we need a mom and we need a baby for breastfeeding to happen. So this diagram illustrates some of the components of how breastfeeding happens. So the two key hormones involved in breastfeeding are prolactin and oxytocin. Prolactin stimulates milk synthesis. Lactocytes make milk when prolactin is present. And oxytocin causes secretion of milk. We'll talk about that more in a couple of slides. During pregnancy, progesterone produced by the placenta blocks milk synthesis so that mothers don't make huge volumes of milk while they're pregnant, even though prolactin levels are high. We also know that cortisol, thyroid, insulin, and growth hormone are important for breast development and for milk synthesis. So disorders such as diabetes and thyroid dysfunction can impact how well a mom can make milk. After delivery, the placenta and progesterone go away, allowing milk synthesis to occur, and then baby at breast stimulates the breast, triggering the milk ejection reflex. And this goes up into the hypothalamus in the brain. Lower dopamine levels stimulate prolactin production, and stimulation of the posterior pituitary stimulates oxytocin release. One of the points I want to focus on here is that it's the loss of progesterone, that we'll talk about a little bit later, that's important to milk synthesis, and that loss of progesterone can influence mom's mood. So I like to teach that there's a three-step cycle to breastfeeding success: let down, latch, and moving milk. So first I want to talk about let down. When I was first breastfeeding my oldest child, who is now about to be a senior in high school, which is amazing to me, but anyway, 17 years ago, I didn't fully appreciate that it was not my baby's incredibly powerful suck that pulled milk from individual lobules of the breast down into the nipple for him to feed, but rather that milk is synthesized in these alveoli that are surrounded by lactocytes, then synthesized milk. And then those lactocytes are surrounded by rubber band-like myoepithelial cells. These are muscle cells. And when the milk ejection reflex is stimulated, these myoepithelial cells contract and actually squirt milk down through these little tubes to the level of the areola and the nipple so the baby can drink. We also know from Peter Hartman's work in Australia that that same oxytocin actually dilates these ducts to make it easier for milk to pass. So if there isn't oxytocin here, the milk will sit up in these lobules perfectly happy and will never make it to the baby. Now, one of the stories that helps me remember the importance of oxytocin and of the myoepithelial cells is the story of Hera and Zeus. This is a painting that is in the National Gallery in London, and I was beyond ecstatic to learn that it was there when I went to London with my family a few years ago, and I dragged my recalcitrant teenage children and I guess 8-year-old through the museum to look at this painting, and they were on their iPhones and very frustrated. But this painting illustrates a very important story from Greek mythology. Greek mythology has enjoyed something of a resurgence in the States with the Percy Jackson novels. I don't know if those are as popular elsewhere in the world, but if you're familiar with Greek mythology, you'll know that Hera, who's pictured here, was the queen of the gods in Greek mythology. And Hera was married to Zeus, the king of the gods. And like many powerful political figures, Zeus had a number of consorts with women who were not his wife. Most of those were mortal women, and those dalliances led to children. And a child of a god and a mortal is a demigod. And one of the demigods that was produced was Hercules, who's pictured here. And you can tell that Hercules was following WHO recommendations for breastfeeding because given that muscle structure, he must be at least 3 or 4 years old. But Zeus and the Greeks understood that breast milk was very important. And the Greeks believed that if a child was fed the milk of a goddess, then that child would become immortal. So Zeus thought, aha, I really like this Hercules kid. I'm going to bring him up to Mount Olympus, and I'm going to have him breastfeed from Hera, and then he will become immortal. So he brings Hercules up, and Hera was sleeping at the time, and tries to latch Hercules onto Hera's breast, and Hera opens her eyes and says, "Who the hell is this kid?" And her milk, which you see here, shoots across the sky, becoming the Milky Way galaxy. So the Milky Way, and the word galaxy comes from the word galactose, which means milk in Greek. And it was believed that it is Hera's milk that formed the Milky Way. So I share this story because oxytocin is powerful. Oxytocin creates galaxies. And oxytocin is also critically important for babies to be able to get breast milk, or for moms to be able to express breast milk if they're pumping at work, or expressing milk for a preterm baby. There are many women I've cared for who actually have a pretty powerful letdown. I don't know if they've ever gotten to the galaxy stage, but I have seen milk clear at least a breastfeeding pillow and possibly 5 to 6 feet across the room. So this milk ejection reflex is familiar to many of us from clinical practice. We also know that milk letdown is affected by mom's environment. And this is my favorite study of all time, conducted by Niles Newton when she was working on her PhD way back in 1948. And Niles was looking into the role of stress and emotion in mothering behavior. And she read in the veterinary literature that if you stress a cow while you're trying to milk the cow will make less milk. She thought that was very interesting. And apparently, the way that they stressed cows in this paradigm was to inflate a paper bag and pop the paper bag over the cow's head while the cow was being milked. Now, I will admit, I grew up in New York City and have really never been very close to a cow, but that whole thing sounds pretty terrifying to me. Nevertheless, Niles thought, well, if stress and a paper bag popping keeps a cow from making milk, how might stress affect a mother's ability to breastfeed her baby? She conveniently had a 7-month-old daughter at the time, and she decided to test what would happen if she were stressed while she was nursing her baby. So she and her husband, who was a physician, designed an experiment. And in the morning, she would wake up and they would weigh her baby, and then she would breastfeed, and then they would weigh the baby afterward to see how much milk was transferred. In the control condition, it was about 167 grams of milk. Then she put her feet in ice water. She had her husband ask her hard math questions and shock her if she got them wrong. She had him wrap a piece of gauze around her big toe and yank until it was painful. And while those torture conditions were going on, she received an injection of either saline or oxytocin. And what she found was, when she had her feet in ice water and got saline, her baby got less than half the volume of milk she would normally get. But with that extra oxytocin, the milk transfer came up almost to normal. And she intuited from this that pain and stress prevent the effects of oxytocin on milk letdown. And therefore, a mother who is pained or stressed is less able to transfer milk to her baby. And the paper, which is fascinating, talks about how this applies clinically. And she said, you can imagine the new mother who's nervous and anxious and isn't sure she's doing this right, who doesn't let down, and then her baby sucks harder because her baby's hungry and isn't getting any milk, and then she's in more pain, and then she lets down even less, and the baby sucks even harder, and you get this vicious feed-forward loop. And when I share this example with medical students, they often say, well, then we should give moms oxytocin. And I look at them and I say, no, we should take their feet out of the ice water. Because the solution to this is not to give women a shot. It's to help them to feel more comfortable and relaxed. And all of you who work clinically know this. All of you have worked with the mother who is worried and unsure and says, I don't know, I don't think I'm doing this right. And she gets the baby on and she says, am I doing this right? Does the latch look okay? I'm just not sure. And we make conversation and we tell her baby's beautiful and we make a joke and she laughs. And all of a sudden the baby goes go-gunk, 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 and the milk is flowing. Because we have lifted that woman's feet out of the proverbial ice water. And so this is why it is so, so important. We focus on mom's experience of feeding and help her to feel comfortable and joyful and engaged with her baby, because that will make the breastfeeding work better. And of course, it will make the mothering work better as well. So the second step of breastfeeding success is latch. And I know that everyone hearing this talk knows what a good latch looks like, but just by way of illustration, here we have from Jane Morton's collection a baby who's on the tip of the nipple, and that hurts a great deal. That baby is chomping on the milk duct so that the milk can't even get out of the breast, and that mother is in pain. Compare that with this baby with a wide open, flanged out latch who's got most of the areola in its mouth. This child is going to be much more effective at transferring milk. This is important to appreciate because it means the baby makes a contribution, and a baby who's not able to organize that latch, it's going to have more difficulty, and that's going to affect the success of the breastfeeding relationship. Lastly, moving milk. Demand drives supply. And we know that the more those lobules are emptied, the more milk a mother is able to produce. And there's fascinating work showing that when the lobules become full, the lactocytes surrounding that lobule are less responsive to prolactin. They don't make milk because there's no place to put it. And basically the breast says, no one's drinking this stuff, so I'm not going to make any more of it. So that's why it's so important to keep mothers and babies together and to make sure that that baby is effectively emptying or draining the breast with each feeding to promote milk production. So I want to step back and think about what this means in terms of mom's brain and baby's brain, because we're going to be talking about depression and anxiety, and a healthy mother is going to be able to engage with her baby, which is going to trigger oxytocin release. A quiet, alert baby with a strong suck can latch and move milk effectively. And that breast stimulation is going to trigger release of oxytocin and prolactin. So this two-person system, which relies on that connection between the brain of mother and baby, is necessary for breastfeeding to be successful. So what might happen if mom is depressed? Well, there's a fascinating body of literature suggesting that being exposed to depression in utero is associated with differences in babies. This isn't treatment for depression. This is just being in the uterus of a depressed mother. So babies who are born to depressed mothers are less neuromuscularly mature. So they're less able to organize that good, strong latch and sustain that latch over time. Their early suckling behavior is different. They don't suckle as consistently or for as long a period, which is going to mean they're not able to move milk and they're not able to stimulate prolactin and oxytocin. And then there's also a relationship between infant temperament and exposure to depression. So some babies are all smiles and look up at mom and make eye contact and engage and respond. They soothe easily. If they're upset, you can pick them up and bounce them for a minute and they calm down. And there are other babies that can't be soothed no matter what. one of my kids, we still talk about the max dance, had to be in a baby carrier being bounced from, I think it was 8 p.m. to 10 p.m., but in retrospect, it feels like 6 p.m. to midnight, or else all bets were off. So babies have different temperaments. So when we think about the mother who's depressed and anxious at birth, her baby may not be as able to latch, may not cue feeding as clearly, and may have a temperament that makes breastfeeding more difficult, and that's going to make breastfeeding harder. So mom's depression is affecting baby's behavior, and then baby is less able to engage in feeding. We also know that mom's mood affects her behavior. So this was a study that was done in Israel with mothers who had depression or anxiety, or mothers who were well. And they brought the mums and babies into the lab, I think it was at 9 months postpartum, and they had them play together. And they measured different behaviors in mums. So one was sensitivity. So sensitivity is when the baby smiles, does mom smile back? When the baby looks upset, does mom comfort the baby? Or does she just kind of sit there like, oh, whatever, you're here, it's all good. And what you can see here is that the depressed moms had the lowest sensitivity in interacting with their babies. The anxious moms had pretty good sensitivity, but not quite as high as the controls. Then they looked at intrusiveness. And intrusiveness is whether a mom could appreciate when a baby wanted to look away. So babies smile, they look at adults, they play, but sometimes they just turn their head like, okay, I'm done now, I need to take a break. And the anxious moms, when the baby turned their head away, would just come around and be like, hi, I'm still here, hello, I'm still here, and wouldn't appreciate that the baby was like, I need to rest now. Or they would sort of close their eyes and mom would stop poking them in the belly to tickle them and not realize that the baby was done. So that anxious mom couldn't see what the baby needed. Then they looked at withdrawal. So was mom animated and engaged, or was she just sitting there like, all right, we're doing this thing with this video. It's going to be over soon. And you can see the depressed moms were more withdrawn. And then lastly, they coded child engagement. So how much did that mom interact with, talk with, play with baby versus just kind of turn away and say, whatever. And you can see here that the control moms were the most engaged, the anxious moms were intermediate, and the depressed moms were the least engaged. So what you can see here is that depression is changing mom's behavior. And when a mom needs to see when baby's cueing to eat and respond to that promptly, needs to realize when baby's done and let baby off breast and settle, depression and anxiety can mess up that signaling process and can make breastfeeding more difficult for both mom and baby. So when we think about this critical physiology and what happens when depression is present, you can see that mom-baby interaction is dysregulated. Baby may have a difficult temperament. Mom may not notice what baby needs as easily. This exposure to depression may affect the mechanics of baby's latch. Baby's not able to get on, not able to get things to work as well. And then that stress, that feed in the ice water, may suppress the release of oxytocin, such that the physiology isn't working as well. So it's not at all surprising that women who stop breastfeeding sooner have more depression symptoms. It may be that the depression messed up the breastfeeding or the weaning made the depression worse, but it's really difficult to untangle which one came first. And so I think it's critically important that when we advocate for breastfeeding, we be careful not to claim that more breastfeeding would stop postpartum depression. More support for mothers, I would argue, would reduce postpartum depression and would also raise breastfeeding rates. But those are two good things that come out of good support for moms, not breastfeeding causing less depression. So now I want to go under the hood and talk about the underlying physiology. And here's where things are going to get a little geeky for a few minutes, so I hope you'll bear with me. And we're going to talk about some of the endocrine factors and neurosteroids that contribute to perinatal depression. So I want to take everybody back for a moment to this slide looking at the different hormones involved in lactation and remind you that it's the loss of progesterone at the time of birth, when the placenta leaves the mom's body, that allows milk synthesis to begin. So we have to lose progesterone to get milk. And I also just wanted to remind everybody of the huge changes in hormone levels that happen over the course of pregnancy. So here, this graph shows levels of estrone, estradiol, and estriol, which are 3 forms of estrogen, and how they change from 8 weeks of pregnancy until 40 weeks of delivery. And you can see that a normal estrogen level is about 2, and it goes up 8-fold by the end of pregnancy. And you can see progesterone over here goes from 20 to 180. So there's a 9-fold increase in progesterone levels over the course of pregnancy. And that has a profound effect on a woman's brain, as we'll talk about in a minute. And then at birth, everything goes haywire. So progesterone levels fall a little bit before birth but plummet. Prolactin levels go up, cortisol levels go up in the baby, estrogen and oxytocin levels go up and then plummet. There is a huge hormonal typhoon going on inside of every mother with the birth of her baby. And those hormonal changes have a really powerful impact on how moms think and feel in those days around birth. And it turns out that there's a hormone I had never heard of until after I finished my fellowship that plays a critical role in this story. So this chart here was something I did have to memorize at one point in taking a board exam, and it gives me a little bit of anxiety every time I look at it. But this is the pathway through which cholesterol is processed to create testosterone and estradiol, cortisol, progesterone. And then the hormone I want to talk about is one called allopregnanolone. So progesterone, which goes up in pregnancy, as we just discussed, is processed into this hormone allopregnanolone. And it turns out that allopreg binds very tightly to the GABA receptor in the brain. And the GABA receptor is the same receptor that medications like Valium and Ativan bind to. It's the same receptor that alcohol binds to. It's the chill out, calm down, mellow out, and fall asleep receptor, if you will. And so during the course of pregnancy, when progesterone levels rise 9-fold, allopregnanolone levels rise as well. And indeed, one of the reasons that women are perhaps so sleepy in that first trimester is that they're basically swimming in a giant pool of allopregnanolone that is massively upregulating and causing them to be really tired. And that's arguably nature's way of saying you're growing a person, you need to rest a little bit more. But those allopreg levels go way, 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 way up. And then when the baby's born, they go way, 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 way down really fast. And if you've ever had a friend or a colleague who's needed to take a medication like Valium, if they don't get their Valium, they are not a happy person. And so essentially in those first couple of days after birth, when progesterone levels are plummeting, women are withdrawing from Valium. And they're feeling this increased anxiety and irritability. And that may actually be part of the mechanism explaining the baby blues that so many women experience. So up to 80% of women are grumpy and cranky in those first few days, about 8 to 10 days after birth. And a big part of that may be this fall in progesterone levels. So scientists have tried to understand this using animal models. And so this was a study looking at a strain of mouse. And the scientists looked at regular wild-type mice, and then they also looked at mice that had had one tiny little subunit of the GABA receptor removed. So the GABA receptor is made of these 2 little circles of subunits. And what the scientists are illustrating here is that during pregnancy, and a mouse pregnancy is only 21 days, it's pretty fast, progesterone levels are initially high, and the mice actually reduce their number of GABA receptors because otherwise they'd sleep all the time. And then with delivery, progesterone levels fall, and GABA receptor levels have to come back up so that the mice have enough receptors to pick up the little bit of progesterone that's still present, and the little bit of allopregnanolone that's still present. But when they knock out this receptor, the mouse can't make more GABA receptors. And when they look at the mom's behavior, this is the mother mouse who doesn't have normal GABA receptors. This is one of her pups that's died. These are her other pups kind of scattered all over the cage. Mom's asleep. She's not taking care of them. And this is a healthy mama mouse who has normal GABA receptors, and she's got all her pups up under her, and she's paying attention to them. So what this suggests is if you mess with that GABA receptor, and this mouse can't adjust to the changing levels of progesterone and allopregnanolone, that mouse can't take care of her pups. And what's fascinating is this mouse otherwise is totally normal. She goes through her life, she can do all the things a mouse needs to do, but she cannot deal with her pups immediately postpartum. And so this is proposed as one model of what happens in postpartum baby blues and in extreme cases in postpartum depression. Interestingly, way back in 1875, a man named George Savage, I would argue, described what happens to mama humans when their GABA receptors aren't happy. And this is this somewhat misogynistically titled Observation on the Insanity of Pregnancy and Childbirth. And Savage writes, about 2 days after delivery, some women become excited, sleepless, and incoherent. They have a flushed face, a rather full pulse, and slight elevation of temperature. This is called milk fever and coincides with the beginning of the flow of milk. So remember, it's that drop in progesterone that allows lactogenesis too. So we have to lose our neurosteroids to get milk. And so that feeling that moms are fussy and cranky and crying and tearful and coming unraveled a little bit about the same time their milk comes in may have a very clear physiologic basis. We also know that some women are more sensitive to shifts in neurosteroid levels than others. And work done in the United States found that if women who had had postpartum depression, who had finished breastfeeding and were now not lactating anymore, had their hormone levels stabilized with an injection and then were given birth control pills of different doses, when the doses shifted, they experienced depression symptoms. But women who had not had depression around pregnancy didn't notice the same changes in levels of birth control pills. So fluctuations in hormones affect some people more than others. And those who are most affected by those fluctuations are going to have the hardest time coping on the very day their milk is coming in. And so this may be another way that depression and breastfeeding difficulties are tied together. Interestingly, there is now a large clinical trial going on in the United States of an allopregnanolone analog to treat postpartum depression. And the concept is if we can give back allopreg to women, we may be able to undo this loss of GABA receptor agonist and help to treat postpartum depression symptoms. So that's the neurosteroid story. Now I want to shift and talk about oxytocin and its role in the autonomic nervous system. So here we're going to go into the brainstem. This is about as geeky as it gets, and then it starts to become a little bit more practical, I promise. And this is the work of Steve Porges, who developed the polyvagal theory. Porges is a psychoneuroendocrinologist, and he studies the role of the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. Now, when I went to medical school, I was taught that the sympathetic system is the fight or flight system, and the parasympathetic nervous system is the rest and digest system. And the key nerve in the parasympathetic nervous system is the vagal nerve. And you may have heard the expression that somebody has vagaled. When the vagal nerve is activated, blood pressure drops, and if it's activated enough, the person drops down on the floor and passes out. I'm familiar with this because when I was a medical student, the very first time I scrubbed a cesarean section, I experienced my vagal nerve engaging and actually had to leave the case so I did not fall out on the floor in front of everybody, which was extremely embarrassing. But the vagal nerve, as we learn about it, is this pass-out nerve. And what Porges taught was actually there is not one vagal nerve. There are two vagal nerves. There is the unmyelinated vagus, which is the one that makes you pass out. And then there is also a myelinated vagus. And Porges argues that the myelinated vagus is the most sophisticated way to engage and cope with stressful situations. So the myelinated vagus is situated in the brainstem, quite close to the centers that control the muscles of the face. And when the myelinated vagus is engaged, people's expressions are more visible. Their face moves more when they talk. They smile and their eyes smile too. And when I make eye contact with someone, the eye contact we are making stimulates the myelinated vagus to adjust the position of the bones in the inner ear so that I can hear her voice and she can hear my voice to the exclusion of background noise. So the myelinated vagus is really important for social communication, for soothing, for calming, for settling. So the first thing we do when we encounter a potential threat is we look at the person and we try the myelinated vagus. We try to make friends. We try to work it out. If that doesn't work, the myelinated vagus fails, we go to the sympathetic adrenal system, and that's the fight or flight system that we've all learned about. So if we tried talking it out and that didn't work, we either get loud and angry or we run away. And if that doesn't work, we go to the unmyelinated vagus, which is we just pass out on the floor, so we don't have to deal with it. And actually our reptilian ancestors use that as a coping mechanism. They play dead because they know that a lot of animals don't want to eat a dead iguana. So if the iguana looks dead, the predator will go away. Now, what does this all have to do with breastfeeding? I promise it's going to tie in. It turns out that this unmyelinated vagus has a nucleus in the brain that has many, many receptors for oxytocin. So when oxytocin is released during nursing, that oxytocin binds to the myelinated vagus and causes the person to become immobilized, not to totally pass out, but basically to get that, oh yeah, I could sit in this rocking chair all day long kind of feeling. It is also the unmyelinated vagus that's important for pair bonding after intercourse. So after orgasm, the partners fall asleep, arguably so that they can get each other's phone numbers the next day. And that, again, is oxytocin acting through the unmyelinated vagus. But it's really, really important for nursing that this unmyelinated vagus works, because you have to sit still for a really long time to breastfeed a newborn. And if you don't feel good about that, it could be really hard to make it work. So some researchers asked what happens to lactation when you interfere with these oxytocin vagal pathways. So they decided to work with the central periaqueductal gray, or CPAG, which is a brain region implicated in the maternal response to nursing in rats. They wanted to see if they applied a little electric charge to that CPAG region so that it wasn't active, how would that affect maternal behavior? And they found that these animals that had a lesion in the CPAG didn't nurse their babies well. It's kind of a complicated diagram, but what we're doing here is looking at one set of animals. The open boxes had a sham surgery, so they wanted to make sure it wasn't the surgery that was causing the behavior change, so they went to sleep for anesthesia but didn't have any lesions applied. And then these animals, our periaqueductal gray is not the oxytocin-rich area, so they had a little electric charge applied to a different part of the brain. And then the circular pieces here are the ones that had the lesion to the oxytocin receptor area. So they did this, and then they watched how the animals took care of their pups. So a mother rat ideally is in this kyphotic position, basically lying with all the teats exposed so that the pups can come up and nurse comfortably. But the ones that had the lesion to the oxytocin area, they did a lot of hovering over. They were kind of walking around and moving and standing over their pups, but they wouldn't get still. And remember, pups are blind and can't hear, and so they can only smell. And if the teat is moving all the time, it's going to be really hard for them to latch. They spent very little time, these animals with the oxytocin lesion, in that kyphosis, easy to access, the teat position. They spent a lot of time supine, so lying on their backs, which makes the teats really hard to get to if you're a rat pup, or a lot of time in a prone position, like with their teats buried into the straw. So they couldn't do the thing they needed to do to sit still to care for their babies. And those babies did not gain as much weight. So if you brought these babies into the pediatrician, they were not gaining weight the way they would be expected to compared to the animals that hadn't had that lesion. So something that changed mom's oxytocin pathways changed the baby's weight gain. Mom's depression, if you will, is affecting the baby. And then I think this is really fascinating. They wanted to see how the mother animals behaved if they were exposed to an intruder. Mother mammals of all kinds, bears, humans, rats, you name it, don't like it when someone messes with them when they're nursing their babies. So they brought another unfamiliar rat into the cage. And when the pups were present, the animals with the sham lesion and the lesion in the non-oxytocin area got upset and attacked for about 10 to 15 seconds. And then they kind of settled down. But these animals that had that lesion in that oxytocin area, they were much more upset and much more defensive and much more angry. So they couldn't sit still to care for their babies, but they really got upset when someone tried to mess with them. So these animals are not able to engage in their normal parenting behavior because their oxytocin pathways are disrupted. So what we hypothesize is that in the best case scenario, in normal conditions, these central oxytocin pathways stimulate the parasympathetic nervous system, that relax, take care of my baby system, and they downregulate the stress response, the sympathetic nervous system. We also know that oxytocin normally reduces cortisol release through its actions on the hypothalamus. And so ideally, more oxytocin means decreased stress reactivity, less depression, and less anxiety. But if there's something not right about those oxytocin pathways, if that mom is not making as much oxytocin or isn't responding to that oxytocin in the expected way, it may actually increase stress reactivity, depression, and anxiety. So maybe something not right about oxytocin explains why breastfeeding is difficult for a mother and her mood is also at issue. So we've looked at this issue in a series of experiments here at UNC Chapel Hill. And in our pilot study, we brought mothers into the lab, helped them get situated. We placed an IV so we could sample their blood repeatedly during an infant feeding session. And then we had them feed their babies as they normally would. So these are all breastfeeding mothers, and we measured oxytocin at baseline at 1 minute, 3 minutes, 7 minutes, and 10 minutes, and then after a post-feed rest. And what you see here is these open circles of the mothers who have pretty mild symptoms of depression and anxiety. And you can see their oxytocin levels are lower throughout a feeding session compared to the moms without symptoms of depression or anxiety. When we looked at a couple of different measures of depression and anxiety symptoms, the Edinburgh Postnatal Depression Scale, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, the higher the depression scale, the lower the oxytocin if you measured the area under that curve during feeding. Spielberger State measures anxiety levels right now, and Trait measures kind of overall anxiety levels. And again, you see this inverse relationship where the worse the mom's symptoms, the less oxytocin that mother was producing during feeding. In a more recent study, we've looked at women who experienced mild to severe childhood trauma, and we found that those mothers who experienced moderate to severe trauma in childhood had lower oxytocin when they were feeding their babies than mothers with mild or no trauma during childhood. And this is really fascinating because there's a substantial literature that suggests that animals that are not licked when they're pups, who aren't cared for by their own mothers, grow up to be less able to care for their own babies. And so this sort of suggests that those oxytocin pathways, these mothers are breastfeeding, they're caring for their babies, but their oxytocin pathways aren't working the same way as a function of what they experienced in their own childhood. And interestingly, in the same population, we found that women who had a history of childhood trauma, this is the ones with the moderate to severe history, introduced formula considerably sooner. So this is at 60 weeks postpartum. So this is any formula. Solids were introduced around 26 weeks for most babies, but this is formula rather than breast milk. The moms with the trauma history introduced formula much earlier than the women without a trauma history. And this was a population who joined a study about breastfeeding, so they were very motivated to breastfeed. So sort of like the medical students I mentioned in the feet and ice water experiment, the question becomes, well, what if we just gave depressed moms oxytocin? If their oxytocin is low, we give them more. We'll fix the problem. And it would be lovely if it were that simple. But the literature that's out there seems to suggest that it may not be simply a matter of squirting some more oxytocin into the mom. And interestingly, when oxytocin is given, it's given in the labor ward intravenously to cause contractions. But for it to affect the brain, it's given as a spray into the nose. So the top of the nose is the cribriform plate, which actually communicates with the brain. So something squirted into the nose can actually pass through that into the brain and affect behavior. And so it's an oxytocin nasal spray that's administered in these experiments. So Ma et al. Conducted a study in a population of women with depression to see how a squirt of oxytocin versus a squirt of saline, so no active medication, might affect the way the mothers spoke about their infants. And the way this experiment was designed, the mothers came to the lab on 2 separate occasions, and they were randomly assigned either to the active medication or to a placebo. And then they asked the mothers, well, tell me about your baby. And what they found is that when women received oxytocin, the quality of their initial statement was more negative. So they might start by saying, well, he's a terrible sleeper, if they'd just gotten oxytocin, versus, well, he's really sweet, if they'd just gotten nasal saline. So it wasn't making them say nicer things about their baby. But then they would talk more about how close they felt to their baby. So they might say, he's a terrible sleeper, but I feel so close to him and I really, love him so much. Whereas, oh, he's a really sweet kid, we're getting along well, might be the comment if they'd just gotten nasal saline. So it wasn't the magic cure for how moms felt about their babies. And then interestingly, when they measured how happy the mothers felt, they reported a lower happiness score after getting oxytocin than they did after getting the placebo. And when they looked at calmness, it wasn't statistically significant, but the mothers were also less calm. So if oxytocin is supposed to be the love and bonding hormone, squirting into somebody's nose doesn't make them more loving and bonded to their children automatically. And there's some interesting work that might perhaps explain why that could be. A number of these experiments have been conducted in men, which is annoying since we take care of women, but it reflects the fact that men don't have menstrual cycles, which makes them easier to study. That is not a good excuse, I want to be clear, but I just want to explain to you why I'm sharing data from men. So in this particular study, the authors wanted to look at how a man's experience as a child with parental separation, which they defined as one parent leaving the child's home before the child was 12, so either divorce or separation or death. They wanted to see how an individual's childhood experience affected the way that oxytocin versus nasal saline changed their stress response. So similar to the previous experiment, the men came to the lab on 2 different days, and they got a spray of either saline or oxytocin. They didn't know which it was. And then they measured their cortisol levels. Cortisol is the stress hormone, over the course of about 35 minutes. And what they found was that among controls, it didn't really affect their cortisol levels. They were maybe a little bit lower with oxytocin than with placebo. But in the men who'd experienced early parental separation, getting a squirt of oxytocin increased their cortisol levels. It made them more stressed than if they got nasal saline. So instead of oxytocin decreasing their stress response and making them feel safe and comfortable, oxytocin made them feel anxious. So we looked at this in the same population where we measured oxytocin during breastfeeding. And we didn't give a nasal spray, but we looked at what the level of oxytocin was during a feeding session. And then we looked at the woman's response to a stressor immediately following that. And the way we do this is a standardized social stressor that was developed and has been used in lots and lots of studies. And it goes like this. The participant is told that they're going to participate in a speech task. And they're going to be given 5 minutes to prepare a speech for why they should be offered a job of their choice. And they're told that we're going to videotape your performance and we're going to observe your body language and see whether you do a good job with this speech. So they have a few minutes to get organized, then they come in and they give the speech. And there are 2 judges who are watching the speech, and those judges are instructed to be as unmoved and stone-faced as they possibly can while this woman is talking or this man is talking. So it's a very negative feedback kind of situation. And then if they finish the speech in less than the allotted time, there's a series of questions, such as, do you have enemies? Why? That need to be answered. So this is a social stressor. This is like being in a really unpleasant situation. And then after that, there's a math task in which the participant has to count backward from 2000 by sevens. And so you're told, 2000, begin. You say 1993, 1986, 1977. Oh, wait, incorrect. Restart, 2000. So this gets people pretty upset pretty effectively. And then there's a recovery period. So what we have in these graphs on the x-axis is how high oxytocin was during the feeding session immediately before the Trier social stress test. And then here, how high the cortisol stress hormone level was at the post-feed rest, so right after the feeding was over, during that speech task, during the math task, and then during recovery. And what we see is that the dark gray line here are the women without depression and anxiety symptoms. And you see that the higher the oxytocin is, the lower their cortisol levels. So they're protected and buffered by that oxytocin. But in the group with symptoms, the higher their oxytocin levels, the higher their cortisol levels. So what this suggests is, as with the experiment I described immediately before this, in the men who'd experienced separation as children, in women who are stressed and anxious, oxytocin doesn't make them less stressed. It actually makes them potentially more stressed. And so it might be that while breastfeeding feels fabulous to individuals who are well, it might make people feel worse if they have depression or anxiety. This could also be about genetic differences. So this is another study with men, with the same caveats we discussed earlier. And here again, they were doing the Trier social stress test. And we're graphing here the cortisol levels in their saliva. And you can see that during the speech and the math task, everybody's stress levels are going up. What they did in this experiment was they did genetic testing to determine the type of oxytocin receptor that these men had. So one receptor type is the GG or AG type, which is the healthier oxytocin receptor type. And then some men had the AA type. And they split the group and allowed half the men to bring a friend with them to help keep them company during this stressful task. And what they found was, in the group with the GG or AG receptor type, having a friend with them remarkably, impressively lowered their cortisol levels during the Trier. So a friend was useful. It was beneficial. But in the AA group, their hormone levels were the same whether they had a friend or not. It did not do them any good whatsoever to have a support person with them. And so what this suggests is that oxytocin may be helpful. So to the extent that the friend was social support and oxytocin, if you have a particular kind of oxytocin receptor, you may not care whether you have somebody with you. It may not do you any good. And it might not make you feel that much better to breastfeed, quite frankly, because oxytocin doesn't feel good to you. It just is the same as everything else. So it's interesting to think about life experience and then also about particular genetics that may be playing a role. And then this study looked at the genotype of the actual oxytocin itself and looked at life experience and early stress, and then how long women breastfed and their mood symptoms. So it's a lot going on here, but I want to walk you through it. So this is an oxytocin genotype. So the CC genotype is thought to be the higher risk genotype. And what the authors found was in somebody with a good childhood, so this is low early adversity, if they had the CC genotype, they breastfed for an average of 28 weeks, and if they had the other genotype, they breastfed for an average of 30 weeks. So it gave you about 2 weeks extra, but not really that big a difference. However, if there was high early life adversity, had a rough childhood, and you had the CC genotype, you only breastfed for about 20 weeks compared to almost 30 in the other group. So adversity was much harder to cope with if you had the CC genotype of oxytocin. Had a much bigger effect on your breastfeeding duration. And they similarly looked at depression scores. And this is interesting. If you had a good childhood and you have the CC genotype, you actually have the lowest depression score. And if you have the CC genotype and a bad childhood, you have the highest depression score. And I think about this a little bit as though that CC genotype meant you were more of a sponge and you absorb what's around you. And if life is good and the people around you are caring, you soak that up and you become less depressed and things go well. But if what's around you is toxic, you also soak that up and have a much harder time. Obviously, it's much more complicated than a sponge. But I think it's really important when we think about different people in our lives who've had different experiences, and one person had what seems like fairly mild problems in their lives and challenges, and they have all sorts of issues, and then another person who's been to hell and back and seems completely fine. Obviously, some of that is temperament and some of that is support, but some of that may be genetic, that some of us may be wired to soak up what's around us for better or for worse, and others of us may be more insulated. And so when it's good, it doesn't feel as good, but when it's bad, it doesn't feel as bad. So now we're done with all the geeky science stuff, and I hope I've given you some food for thought. This is very much a field in progress. We are just wrapping up the 5-year study looking at oxytocin levels during feeding and the Trier social stress test, and we will hopefully have the final take on those data being published in the next 4 to 6 months, and we'll be able to kind of put together the story from that work. But we certainly haven't figured out how this all works. But I think you can appreciate that it's complicated. So how do we take all of that science and apply it to the integrated management of mood disorders and breastfeeding problems? So I'm going to walk you through some additional cases. So this is a mom who came to me as a 35-year-old, having had her second baby at 5.5 months postpartum. And she came to see me for breastfeeding-associated pain. She said the pain is constant and burning with deeper pain on and off throughout the day. Sometimes it feels like she can't completely empty her breast. The pain radiates to her arm and armpit. I did a physical exam. There was no evidence of mastitis. There was no cracked nipple. There was no vasospasm. But we had screened her for depression, and her score was a 15. And so after taking a careful history and doing the exam, I said, tell me a little bit about how things are going. And she started to cry. And she said she was working from home, and she had her infant and then her older child, and the way that her office was situated, she couldn't get out to go to the kitchen without walking past her children, who would then say, Mommy, and come hug her. So she would sort of sit locked in her office, barricading the doors so they wouldn't bother her, and she'd worry all day about when am I going to be able to go out to go to the bathroom without my kid running into me, and she was totally overwhelmed. And by the time we worked through all of those issues and started talking about addressing her anxiety, it became pretty clear that she did have some breast pain, but what she really needed was therapy and support. And I don't mean by that that women with breast pain don't also have an organic etiology we need to treat, But it's a lot more socially acceptable, at least in the US, to make an appointment with somebody about breastfeeding pain than to make an appointment about postpartum depression or anxiety. So the first thing I want to share with you is how the Edinburgh Postnatal Depression Scale works. This scale has been translated into hundreds of languages. It is 10 questions long, and I put a box here around question number 10. So question number 10 is the thought of harming myself has occurred to me. And it's really important, if you start using this tool in your practice, someone is going to answer yes at some point. And it's really important that you know what you're going to do with that information. Because if a patient endorses that she's thinking of hurting herself, you want to make sure you know how to help her. You know how to find out whether that's real intent to commit suicide or just, gosh, sometimes I don't want to do this anymore. And that you have a place to send her that is safe and a way to help her. There was a terrible incident about a year ago in California where a woman had checked the sometimes box, and they called the cops, and they put her in handcuffs, and they took her to the emergency room, and they put her in a locked, padded room. And 10 hours later, a social worker talked to her, was like, yeah, I think you're okay, and sent her home. And that was all they did for her. And that is not what we want to offer our patients. So you need to know what you're going to do with the information. And we need to screen. So postpartum depression affects up to 15% of mother-baby dyads. The EPDS is a validated screening tool. It takes less than 5 minutes to fill out. In the US, it's a billable service. And actually, that CB2 code has been updated. But you may be able to collect reimbursement for it to help a practice understand that this is useful to do. Like every screening tool we use in clinical practice, you have to interpret it in the context of the clinical situation. So a score higher than 13 picks up about 75% of depression, and it's about 84% specific. So most of the time when they have that, they've really got depression, but not always. So a woman with an Edinburgh of 13 does not have depression. She has symptoms, and she needs to be evaluated. And it's important to look at the responses, especially that question 10. Because what you really don't want to do is say a woman's filled that out and her total is 8, but she did circle the harming myself question. And you don't look at that, and she's gone and left your office and driven off with 3 kids in the car, and you realize she's thinking of hurting herself and you haven't addressed that. You do not want that to happen. So you've got to look at that question before she leaves the building or before you leave her side. And then there are 2 questions that are really important to ask. One is, are you sleeping? And no, you're not sleeping, you have a baby, but can you sleep when the baby sleeps? And the other question to ask is, are you having any scary thoughts? My psychiatrist friends taught me to ask these questions, and the scary thoughts questions refers to the intrusive thoughts that women can have when they're really anxious. And those can be thoughts of, oh my gosh, what if I drop the baby? Oh my gosh, what if I get in a car accident? Oh my gosh, what if I drown the baby while I'm giving the baby a bath? That would be so horrible. Oh my God, I don't know if I can give the baby a bath. And I think anyone who's a parent occasionally has an, oh my God, I don't know if I can do this kind of feeling, but this is multiple times a day. So I remember seeing a patient a few years ago who'd come in for low milk supply, and she'd filled out her Edinburgh, and it was like a 7. And I said, oh, so you're having any trouble sleeping? You have any scary thoughts? And she said, she kind of looked at me, and I was running behind because I had taken too long with the last patient, and I sort of plowed through it and kept going. She came back 2 weeks later for follow-up, and she had a 17 on her EPDS. And I said, oh my God, what happened? And she said, well, you know, you asked me that question about scary thoughts. And the thing is, I'm a social worker, and I take care of human trafficking victims. And now I have a baby girl, and all I can think about is, oh my God, what could happen to this little girl when she grows up? And we got her in with a therapist, and she was able to work through that. But if I hadn't asked that question, she's a social worker. She knows how to fill out the questionnaire. It is not hard to see what the right answers are if someone wants to give the right answers. And it wasn't until she had that prompt that she realized what was going on, and she got the treatment that she needed. It's also really important to follow up to figure out, is this person having a really bad week because they have mastitis, or do they have full-on depression? And you can have mastitis and depression at the same time. But if someone has a fever of 102 and their breast is rock hard and red and in pain, they may feel pretty terrible. But once they're treated, they may not necessarily have depression. So what do we do when we identify someone with depression? So first, we want to demystify this. We want to say, you are not alone. Postpartum depression happens to many women to varying degrees. You are not the only person this has ever happened to. You are not to blame. Hormonal changes play a big role. Depending on the health literacy and background of the patient, I may talk about allopregnanolone and Valium withdrawal to explain that this is physiology. This isn't her not loving her baby. And then finally, with help, you will get better. We have to give women hope that this is going to improve. And we have to talk about sleep. And we need to balance the importance of on-demand feeding with maternal medical need for sleep. And I'll talk about that more in a couple of slides. We have to make sure moms are eating. Particularly if she doesn't have a lot of support, she may be home by herself and eating chips out of a bag while she's nursing her baby. And eating carbohydrates all the time is not good for your brain. So she needs protein. She needs a can of nuts next to her in addition to the chips at minimum. But ideally, someone who's also an adult who speaks in sentences coming to visit her in the middle of the day and bringing her food. And then, is she engaged in life outside her home? Has she done anything for herself since this baby was born? And then we offer or refer for psychotherapy. Now, I want to talk about sleep because this is always a sticking point between kind of the psychiatry camp that says you need sleep and the breastfeeding camp that says you need to breastfeed. And in working very closely with the psychiatry team at UNC, we've come up with a strategy that actually works pretty well. So the goal for medical need for sleep in a depressed or anxious woman is 6 hours of continuous sleep. And that's really hard to do if you're breastfeeding. It's also really hard to do if mom is so anxious that even if someone else is caring for the baby, she can't go to sleep. So medication can help to get sleep to happen. And then what we've encouraged patients to do is to think about enlisting the partner or another caregiver to bring baby to mom just for feeding during the 6 hours of protected time. So let's say it's 6 p.m., partner comes home from work or other caregiver comes in to help, mom feeds the baby, hands off the baby, takes a shower, crawls into bed, turns on the white noise, puts on the earplugs, perhaps takes a little bit of medication, we'll talk about that in a minute, so she can go to sleep. And then when that baby cues, the partner comes into the room, gently wakes mom and situates her side lying, latches the baby on with mom's help, and mom basically has to open half an eye while that baby nurses. And then the other caregiver takes the baby, settles the baby, soothes the baby, diapers the baby, cares for the baby. So mom's boobs are active, but she doesn't have to do anything. And that can really help to get 6 hours of at least restful sleep, even if it's not completely uninterrupted. And then after 6 hours at midnight, mom can be first up, and the other caregiver can get some rest. This also, even in couples who do not have any depression issues, can help with the resentment that some women feel that because they've got the breasts, they're up and breastfeeding all night long. And it feels sort of silly to wake up the partner because, you know, you're already up, so you might as well change the diaper. But I remember seething a fair amount as I looked at my sleeping husband and thought, why the hell does he get to sleep and I'm up changing this damn diaper? So had I understood this when I had little ones, I might have gone to sleep from 6 to midnight. And then he could go to sleep from midnight to 6, and I would say, oh, it's fine he's sleeping because he did the first shift. So this can be a really helpful strategy. It's also so important to simplify the feeding plan. And often in breastfeeding, we're seeing mothers who are struggling with low supply, who are putting the baby to breast and then bottle feeding the baby and then pumping milk for the baby and then cleaning up everything and spending, 120 out of every 150 minutes involved in getting milk out of them or into the baby. And those really intensive feeding plans can generally only be sustained but for a couple of days. So it's really important to figure out what's working well and then simplify the feeding plan. It is critically important that mom have time to enjoy her baby outside of getting milk out of her and into the child, because otherwise it can create a really damaging dynamic for that mother-baby pair. To try to sort this, I start my lactation visits by asking what's going well. And that's so important because if mom can't think of anything that's going well, we know we have a really big problem. Or if she says, well, I'm making plenty of milk, but it really hurts, and I wish I could nurse without clenching my teeth and, crushing the arms of the sofa because it's so painful, we know that she's making plenty of milk, and we can say, well, it's great you're making plenty of milk, but excruciating pain is not how this is supposed to go. Or if she says, I love breastfeeding, even though I'm not able to make all the milk my baby needs, well, then we need to make sure that baby's going to breast. And even if she might get another tablespoon if she pumped for 45 minutes instead of putting the baby to breast, if she loves breastfeeding, we better make damn sure breastfeeding is at the center of our feeding plan. So we really need to make sure we're taking into account mom's experience. So the sleep piece is so critical that a sleep aid can be really helpful, particularly before a medication like SSRI kicks in. So trazodone is an older antidepressant that also helps with sleep. And one of the major benefits of trazodone compared with a medicine like Ambien is that it doesn't make mothers forget what happened. So particularly moms who are anxious are not going to take well to the idea that they took a medication last night and fell asleep and then stuff happened that they don't remember. That is not going to sit well with them. And trazodone doesn't have that forgetting effect. It just makes you sleepy. So the starting dose that we use is 25 milligrams, just half a tablet, and that can really knock people out. And getting 6 hours of sleep in a row can completely change a person overnight. So if I see a patient on a Tuesday and we work on some sleep and she comes back the next day, she may feel like a completely different person. So that's a really quick improvement. For moms who are having a lot of anxiety, a little bit of benzodiazepine can be helpful until the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor kicks in. And Klonopin, because it has a longer half-life, can be just a little bit twice a day until the SSRI kicks in. Sertraline has the best safety profile of the currently available selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. It's important to start that with just half a tablet for the first 6 days because some moms feel irritable with it and they can kind of come onto it a little bit more gradually and then increase to 50. It really kicks in after about 2 to 3 weeks. It's really important that the baby's provider be on board with this plan and that there's an ongoing conversation and communication between the mama provider and the baby provider. Because the last thing you want is to talk to the patient, counsel her, make a plan to start a medication, and then have her go to the pediatrician, and the pediatrician say, oh my God, you can't breastfeed taking that, and then we have a big mess. So it's really important. If the pediatrician is going to say you can't breastfeed taking that, then that is not going to be a medication that's going to work. Perhaps there's an opportunity to educate the pediatric provider if they don't know the data, but that's another conversation. So this is a little bit on the data. This was a study conducted in a population of moms and babies who were being treated with sertraline. Sertraline affects serotonin, and it turns out that the platelets, which are in the bloodstream, make serotonin. And so the SSRI medication changes platelet 5-HT concentration, serotonin metabolite. And so they were able to show that in the mothers, the amount of whole blood 5-HT goes down once the mom starts taking the medication. But in the breastfed babies, there really isn't much of a change. There's no consistent pattern. So what this suggests is that even though the medication is affecting mom, it is not getting into baby's bloodstream at a level high enough to change serotonin levels in the baby's platelets. And thus, presumably, it's not getting to the baby's brain at a level high enough to change the baby's brain. So this is another patient that came to see me, a 35-year-old who'd had her first baby who was 7 months postpartum with ongoing breastfeeding-associated pain. She had been seen by multiple lactation consultants without relief, and she talked about her breastfeeding struggles as a Rubik's Cube, which was actually pretty hilarious, and she was pretty proud of that. When we started talking, she started to tell me about her baby's birth. She'd been induced at 42 weeks for post-dates. There had been some meconium, and the baby had been to the NICU for 24 hours. And the patient was absolutely devastated by the fact that her baby had gone to the NICU. She herself was an intensive care unit nurse in adult intensive care, and she felt that her baby was unnecessarily exposed to the ICU, had to get an IV. She should have been there to stop that. It was all her fault. It was awful. It was terrible. And it was just absolutely devastating to her. And I share this story because birth distress really stays with people. It stays with people well through the first 12 months postpartum. So in this study, Jenny Gamble and colleagues looked at women who had experienced birth distress and women who had not. So the black boxes are women with birth distress. And what you see is, looking at quality of life, it is lower, significantly so, out to 12 months for women who experienced a traumatic birth. In women who had psychiatric issues or mental problems, the p-value is not quite significant, but you can see much lower quality of life levels out to 12 months. And then for those without a psychiatric history, they were significantly lower out to 12 months. And so this patient I was seeing had a stressful birth experience, and it was sticking with her 7 months out. And what's interesting is that when I looked at her discharge summary from her hospitalization, and this is a function of bad medical documentation in America, but perhaps it's true globally as well. The note said, patient had an uncomplicated vaginal delivery, baby briefly in NICU for meconium, now breastfeeding well, discharged to home. So the person taking care of her didn't see this as a devastating and horrible experience, even though this patient was still wildly traumatized 7 months out. And so I think it's so important for us to appreciate that trauma is in the eye of the beholder. And what we view as oh, well, that just happened, it's no big deal, the heart rate went down for a little bit, we got on our hands and knees, and then it was all good. Mom may think, oh my God, my baby's dying. And there's no way for us to suppose, based on what we see, whether or not a mom's going to experience a birth as traumatic. And when we unpack those issues, we may be able to address what's really driving some of these problems, such as breastfeeding pain and struggles with breastfeeding. So then this is one more case of a mom with pain. This mom came to see me with pain with breastfeeding during letdown, so she was pumping and bottle feeding. She had a history of postpartum depression, had been hospitalized once in the past for major depression, and on this particular day, her Edinburgh score was 4, so completely normal. She'd seen her psychiatrist this morning. She said, my mood is great, but this breastfeeding, it really hurts. So we watched her feed the baby, and the baby got a good latch, and then started pulling away, and the tongue started clicking during letdown. And Mom said, ow, this really hurts. The baby was kind of coming on and off after the letdown. Milk was spilling out of the sides of his mouth. He was choking and coughing, and Mom said, I don't understand why it hurts so much. So this is about how depression affects mom's sensitivity. So this baby was being flooded by an overactive letdown, and Mom was totally oblivious. Like, she didn't even notice the baby was choking. She's like, I don't understand why it hurts. And the baby's going, and she's just, I don't get it. And so even though her mood symptoms had improved, even though her Edinburgh score was normal, her sensitivity to her baby was completely off. And she couldn't see that her baby was choking and thus biting and thus causing pain. So what we needed to do was help her understand that her flow was so fast that her baby was choking. And so we talked about a laid-back nursing position. We talked about, if that letdown was really strong, even unlatching baby and letting down into a burp cloth or into, a silicone pump or something, and then bringing baby back so she could hang on to that milk. And that then it would be less painful. But she was like, oh, I had no idea. And what I remember so vividly about this patient was that the patient immediately before that we'd seen had mastitis, and she had been completely connected with her baby. And as she's talking to me and has a fever and has the red breast and everything else, she's smiling and cooing, the baby's looking at her, and she's looking at the baby, and it was this beautiful symbiosis. And in contrast, this mother with the pain and obliviousness, the baby was smiling and looking around, and from Mom's perspective, it could have been a brick sitting on her lap. She was not at all attending to him. So maternal mood issues affect that connection, and we need to heal that mother-baby connection in order to make sure that both of them are well. And in doing so, we can also facilitate successful breastfeeding. There are some interventions specifically designed to address that mother-baby connection. So Circle of Security is a curriculum that looks at basically attachment theory. It talks about the idea that every child needs a secure base so that can support the child's exploration, watch over the child, delight in the child, help and enjoy the child. And then, if something's not right, welcome that child home to protect the child's comfort, delight, and organize that child's feelings. And we know that in the first year of life, it's critically important that every child has an adult figure that provides a secure base and a safe haven to return to. And that attachment is fundamentally important to that child's lifelong mental health. So not only are we helping breastfeeding when we help moms respond to their baby's cues, but we're facilitating this attachment that's critically important for lifetime well-being. And I think one of the things that's underappreciated about those of us who work in lactation is we're the only people who look at the mother-baby as a unit, right? Certainly general practitioner physicians and midwives who provide mother-baby care do some of that, but the model that's dominant where I practice in the U.S. is there's a doctor for the mom and there's a doctor for the baby, and those people are in different offices, sometimes in different states, in completely different health systems, not ever talking to each other. And the mommy doctor's looking at the mommy and the baby doctor's looking at the baby. And so one of the roles we have to play as lactation specialists is really being mother-baby specialists and fostering that connection, not only the connection of the breast to the baby's mouth, but the broader connection of that mother and child. So Maria Muzik is a researcher in the US who developed a really exciting project called Mom Power, which a little bit more geeking out for the very end of this talk. And this was an intervention designed for moms of children up to age 6 who'd experienced trauma in their lifetime. So they recruited in primary care sites and delivered the project in the community. And along the same lines as the circle of security, they developed this tree model. And they talked about how every child needs roots, needs a safe haven to connect, nurture, restore, and repair, and then a secure base to explore. And when the child is exploring, the parent's role is to enjoy, help, and attend to the child. So they worked with mothers who often had never experienced positive parenting in their own lives. And if the child was doing something they weren't supposed to do, you needed to enjoy, help, or attend, or nurture, restore, and repair. Not say, stop that right now, smack them. That is not enjoy, help, or attend, and that is not nurture, restore, repair. So they would work with these mothers and children to help show them what appropriate attachment parenting looks like. And what was fascinating is, she said, for part of the program, the mothers went to one area and the kids went to another area. And then when they reunited, they were able to see that reunion and see that connection and watch the mothers develop the skills to welcome their children back after that separation and see that they were improving their ability to do that. So every study needs a really fancy assay to show that it's working. And so they use something called functional MRI, which is when you put the study participant in an MRI scanner and look at brain activity while they're listening to a particular sound. So this was the who's crying task, and the mother was in the MRI machine, and they said, you're going to listen to a baby crying, and they had a crying sound. And then they said, imagine your baby crying. And that's mom's distress about caring for their own child, not just some other child. And then they said, imagine you are the baby crying. How do you feel about your own distress? And they watched what happens to the mother's brains. And what they found was that at the beginning of the study, women had considerably lower empathy. They were not so distressed for their baby, but they were very distressed for themselves. And what they found was, after the study, those women in the treatment program increased their empathy and increased their response to worrying about their own baby crying, whereas the control participants didn't have that experience at all. So what this suggests is that by teaching and engaging mothers to respond to their babies, we can actually change their brains so that they are more empathetic and more able to listen and more able to respond. And I think this is the power that really good mother-baby support offers. And really good breastfeeding support is by definition really good mother-baby support. So in addition to teaching a mother to read baby's cues to know when to feed, we're teaching a mother to see her baby and respond to her baby and see her baby's needs. And that is going to help her to develop the skills not only to feed her baby, hopefully for 2 years and beyond, but for a lifetime, see her child and respond to her child. So I think it's really critical that we build this into our repertoire as mother-baby specialists, that we're fostering a connection that includes the amazing things that breast milk can do, but more broadly includes the amazing thing that a strong connection between a mother and a child can accomplish. So I wanted to share with you a couple of resources if this was interesting or exciting. One is the Academy of Breastfeeding Medicine Protocols. So I'm actively involved in ABM and am the president-elect. We put together more than 20 evidence-based, up-to-date protocols looking at management of a variety of breastfeeding issues. There's a protocol specifically looking at depression and discussing medical management of depression. There are also protocols on pain with breastfeeding, on model hospital policies, on galactagogues, on indicated supplementation, on jaundice. Basically, you name it, if it happens to a breastfeeding mother-baby dyad, we have a protocol. So if you're not familiar with the ABM resources, I encourage you to check them out. They're available free to anyone. At UNC, we have a set of breastfeeding management algorithms that are at mombaby.org/breastfeeding that include our management for depression and then ways of managing breastfeeding-associated pain. Postpartum Support International is a fantastic patient advocacy group that looks at management of postpartum depression. They have wonderful patient materials. They put on a great conference. They have trainings available for providers to become better attuned to managing perinatal depression and anxiety. So if you want to learn more, that's a great resource. And then lastly, the Center for Women's Mood Disorders at UNC is where a lot of this work is being done. So to recap what we set out to discuss today, we wanted to review what's known about the association between breastfeeding and postpartum depression. I think I've hopefully convinced you that there's considerable overlap between breastfeeding difficulties and depressive symptoms, so we need to screen for and treat both of them. And that means not only that lactation professionals need to look for depression, but that folks managing depression need to know about breastfeeding and need to know about things like the how do you sleep and breastfeed at the same time strategy. And if that psychology or psychiatry professional doesn't know a lot about breastfeeding, whereas a breastfeeding support person in the community who appreciates that mom needs to sleep and appreciates that connection between mom and baby is important. That said, the evidence suggests that breastfeeding in and of itself does not prevent postpartum depression. I said we'd explain mechanisms linking depression with breastfeeding difficulties. And we talked about shared mechanisms that affect lactation and maternal mood, suggesting that breastfeeding problems and depression may be biologically linked. So this is where progesterone and allopregnanolone, as well as oxytocin and cortisol, and the relationships among those may explain why shorter breastfeeding and more depression run together, that there's actually biochemistry and biology behind that. And then lastly, when it comes to devising strategies for treating depression and supporting ongoing breastfeeding, we need to screen early and often, start with non-medical therapy, address both sleep and the feeding plan. Mama's got to sleep, and she's got to do something other than feed the baby when she's awake. And then teach mothers to recognize and respond to baby's cues. I think that's where we are really situated to change the lifetime health and well-being of the moms and babies we serve. If we can help them to connect and see each other and recognize each other, that has an impact that will last a lifetime. I wanted to close by thanking the many, many people I'm fortunate enough to work with. This picture is part of the team in the Mother-Baby Lab that does the Mood Mother and Infant Study. Karen Gruen, who's hiding here behind one of her RAs, is the director of the lab and a fabulous research colleague. And then these are just a subset of some of the fabulous people I'm able to work with. I also want to acknowledge the National Institutes of Health and PCORI that fund some of this work. Thank you very much.